to the ACT branch of the AIIA. My name is Keith McMichael and I'm president of the branch. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. The branch is definitely overdue in having a close look at developments in our Pacific neighbourhood. As the recent meeting of the Pacific Islands Forum showed us, Pacific leaders have an incredible lot on their plate these days, from managing the impact of climate change, handling pandemics, building back after natural disasters, maintaining security, just to scratch the surface. And as recent visits by the Australian Prime Minister and Foreign and Pacific Ministers have demonstrated, members of the Pacific family, including Australia, are devoting a lot more attention to the region. Now, we hope that the Pacific panel tonight will illuminate what Pacific nations see themselves as the challenges they confront and how they are seeking to respond individually, collectively, and with bilateral and multilateral development partners. So to help us gain those insights, it's a great privilege to welcome two of the Pacific's most senior diplomats, the High Commissioners to Australia of Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. Our first speaker is His Excellency Mr. John Kali, who is PNG's High Commissioner to Australia. High Commissioner Kali has a wealth of public sector experience, having served at the highest levels in PNG government for almost 40 years. Since arriving in Canberra in early 2019, he has set up education and training partnerships between institutions such as the University of Papua New Guinea with the ANU and CIT. I note his sporting prowess, having represented PNG, I believe, in Australian rules football and cricket, which is perhaps unusual in an otherwise mad-keen rugby league land. Our second speaker is His Excellency, the High Commissioner of Solomon Islands to Australia, Mr. Robert Sisilo. Mr. Sisilo has more than 30 years' experience in international relations and trade. He has been in his current role since January 2020, having served previously as his country's ambassador to the United States, with concurrent accreditation to the United Nations and Canada between July 2017 and 2019. From 1996 until 2004, he served as ambassador to the European Union, Belgium, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, as well as High Commissioner to the United Kingdom and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization. I think that just about covers it, the whole world. Now, our format tonight is High Commissioner Kali will speak first for about 15 minutes, followed by High Commissioner Sisilo. After the presentations, I'll invite questions from the floor and from online participants. Please keep your questions focused as per usual, and we'll finish at 7 p.m. And before we start, I'd like to commend the contribution to tonight's event by Branch Council member Brad Innes, who initiated contact with both diplomatic missions. So I call on High Commissioner Kali to make his remarks. Excellent.
Awilu Nogita. Thank you, Drew. I lost my way getting here. It's a bit like the Pacific Islanders, huh? When we sail, we always tell by the stars. But here it's a bit dark, so I couldn't tell the stars up there. So eventually use the modern ICT with the guidance of our good friend over there to find my way here. Anyway, let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting us to be here this afternoon. By acknowledging the traditional landowners of this wonderful place, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri nations, the elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge my good friend here, seasoned diplomat from Solomon Islands, one of my closest neighbors, apart from Indonesia, Australia, and on the north, the Micronesians. And I also want to acknowledge all of you here for showing your interest in what is happening in the Pacific region. When we talk about the Pacific, you must look up the dictionary and find out what Pacific means. It simply means soothing, comfortable, easygoing, want for conciliation, a desire for peace, and a desire for negotiations, sitting down, having a chat, inviting people into their houses, having a meal together, and understanding one another. We are against antagonism. We are against wars. We regard as everyone as our friends. We are enemies to none. And we respect all our international partners. And we treat them with respect in the same way we expect them to treat us. What I'm going to address is basically the challenges that Papua New Guinea faces. I'm not going to talk too much about the region because I'm no expert. But what I will concentrate on is the challenges that Papua New Guinea faces and the fact that we now have a new government. And I will try and outline as much as I can in a very small way, because I'm only limited to 15 minutes. Otherwise, we would be sitting here all afternoon to listen to what the Papua New Guinea government's agenda is. But very briefly, these are some of the key agenda items that the Papua New Guinea government has decided to address. And we will start with the fact and put it into context, how this government came into being and which political party brought Papua New Guinea to independence. It was Pangu Party, led by the father of the nation, late Grand Chief Sir Michael Somare, who founded the political party called Pangu Party, along with a number of Australians who were living and working in Papua New Guinea, like Tony Wouters. They founded the political party, and through the leadership of Sir Michael Somare, led Papua New Guinea to independence. And it was the Labour government that gave independence to Papua New Guinea. It now happens that after almost more than 40 years, that same Pangu Party, which broke away from the coalition 3 years ago, was renewed and has now won 39 seats out of the 118 seats to form the government. So in his address to the parliament, this is what James Marape said. Pangu gave us political independence. This party, and a new generation of leaders, will deliver Papua New Guinea from economic and give it economic independence. So that is going to be the focus of this new government's agenda, is to give Papua New Guinea economic independence. Number of strategies it has decided to embark on are firstly, strengthening the democratic process. We have been through recently an election which I'm not proud of. It was fraught with violence, fraught with a lot of challenges. But all we can do is to look at the mistakes we have made during the elections, do an independent audit of what happened, address those challenges, and move on from there, and strengthen the institutions of democracy to take us through. But the challenge is to give every eligible voter one vote. Not like what has happened in the past, where you gather in tribal groupings and select someone to put all the votes down. We call that guided democracy. So that's the first, and I think the most important challenge for this government is to address democracy, the institutions of democracy, and restore confidence back to our government. Secondly, is to develop and strengthen a resilient economy. How are we going to do that? Well, we want to go back and look at our budget processes and look at how we can separate revenues from operations so that we don't cloud them up, and make sure that revenue collections are given proper and safe areas. Third, and one of the most important agendas is to build economic infrastructure. That is infrastructure that is going to connect Papua New Guinea. Roads, bridges, wharves, airports, ICT and energy infrastructure, which is going to be responsible for connecting every single part of Papua New Guinea. The ICT Connect program through the state-owned enterprises who deliver the public utilities. The state-owned enterprises are under immense investigations now by the World Bank, by the ADB, by the other international organizations to strengthen and to reform them so that they can deliver services to our people. The fourth one is our natural resources, addressing our natural resources. As you know, Papua New Guinea is endowed with a lot of natural resources: gold, copper, oil, gas, energy, forest, fisheries. But how do we unlock this potential so that our people become the beneficiaries of these resources? And the government is really committed to ensuring that some of the current projects which are on hold will be kickstarted. For example, the Pogera joint venture, the Wafi Golpu, the Pinian, Papua, Pasca A, all these are enormous potential for gold production. And our government intends to review the revenues that are coming from taxation and equity so that Papua New Guinea benefits from these resources. But we must bear in mind that a lot of these projects only have a lifespan of 40 years to go before they die out. So we have to go back to toiling our land through agriculture. And this is why the government is keen on focusing on forestry, fisheries, and agriculture with emphasis on downstream processing and import substitution so that we can grow, produce, and consume locally and where necessary, export those agricultural products. Papua New Guinea's majority of the population live in the rural areas, almost 85%. And that's where agriculture is the most, the basic activity. So our Prime Minister is keen and our government is keen on making and empowering the people in the rural areas to be able to engage in those key sectors of fisheries, forests, and tourism. Our government is also keen on encouraging people to be involved in tourism, mostly ecotourism, to make use of the environment that we live in and get people to come and witness the real life that we enjoy. Not to be hauled up in big hotels in Port Moresby or Lae, but to bring them down and for them to see the real life that we live. And maybe they can go back and tell some stories of their own. The other key priority is to encourage and woo investors into the country. But we're developing the infrastructure network, the ports. We feel that is a way of encouraging people to come and invest, but also to be partners with our government, our private sector in that space to develop the infrastructure in our country. Our government is putting aside millions of kina, 200 million kina, to encourage small and micro business, encourage small people in the communities to be involved in business and to be given the tools in financial management, in business administration, but also in looking after their crops so that they can also become businessmen in their own right. And once they start, they want to get a lot of those business in the informal sector into the formal sector, so we can increase our tax base as we move forward. Sorry, I'll go very quickly then. In terms of the law and order, we want to give confidence to investors. We want to address our law and order issue in the country. Police force, getting a lot of support from the Australian government in terms of capacity and capability development. Corruption it's really killed the country. So this government is keen on and is established and will make the independent commission against corruption operational and functional, and make it and have it resourced so that it can go out and get those who engage in corrupt practices to be brought to account. Education, educated population is the key to development, but we want to digitize education, and I encourage, as the patron of a very small non-government organization, it's called Lighthouse. We are trying to collect computers, refurbish them, and bring them to Papua New Guinea and introduce them to schools so that kids can have access to digital education. So if you're interested, I'm happy to give you my address, email address, and the address of this non-government organization. If you have laptops which are just lying around, give it to me. I'll make use of them. In the and of course, institutional partnerships between schools, high schools, and tertiary institutions, so that we can have exchange of students coming in between Papua New Guinea and Australia, and of course other Pacific Island countries. Health, we really want to strengthen our health sector, which is really fragmented. The COVID really exposed that. So we're getting a lot of support from the Australian government. I'm really thankful to them. They've set up a team of people to get up there to look at the structure, all the way from the central government to the provincial administration to the local level, and see how we can strengthen the delivery of health services. I just want to finish by saying we have a very strong security cooperation with the Australian Defence Force, our Defence Force, and the Australian Defence Force. Very strong and reputable defence cooperation treaty there. But we want to encourage the Defence Force to go more into supporting natural disasters, to use the force usefully in the area. So get some training, and our Melanesian group also thinking seriously about setting up a coordinated center for disaster deployment throughout the Pacific. Papua New Guinea and Australia have a comprehensive strategic economic partnership, a long-term one. In the past, we've only had 1 year, 2 year agreements. This time around, we decided that we'll have a long-term CCEP. There's 6 different pillars under that CCEP, dealing with human capital, social development, people-to-people relations, strong democracies and governance, security cooperation. I'm happy to share that CCEP with you, but it's a really important document and important relationship building document. And a lot of these priorities I've outlined are also reflected in the CCEP, so that bilateral relationship and cooperation and partnership will support the implementation of a lot of those key areas. Thank you, Drew.
All right, thank you very much. Now we can ask High Commissioner Sisilo to carry on.
Thank you. Yeah, let me first begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. And let me also thank Heath McMichael, the president of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, ACT branch, for inviting me to take part in this panel's discussion on the challenges facing the Pacific. First and foremost, climate change. In the Boy Declaration on Regional Security, our leaders adopted when they met in Nauru in 2018, they reaffirmed that climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific, and our commitment to progress the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And at their meeting in Suva only last month, our leaders again reconfirmed that position and underscored the urgency to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees through rapid, deep, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. In this respect, our leaders declared that the Pacific is facing a climate emergency that threatens the livelihood, security, and well-being of our people and our ecosystems, backed, of course, by the latest science and the daily lived realities in Pacific communities. But I think finally we have some good news on climate change here. The Labour government, I think via the House of Representatives, has passed a bill a couple of weeks ago to put its 43% emissions reduction target by 2030 into law. A law I hope will set a clear direction on climate change and an assurance that the change of government does not automatically mean a change of policy. I understand the bill is now before the 76 senators of the upper house, where it is expected to sail through. It will, I understand, also enact into law its net zero by 2050 target and task the Climate Change Authority to advise on future goals and the minister responsible to make an annual progress statement in Parliament. So fingers crossed for the Senate deliberations on a bill. If passed, I think we'll start a new era of climate and energy certainty. One that, in the words of the climate change minister, is well overdue, and the 43% emissions reduction target is the floor and not a ceiling to its ambitions. So at least, and with the Senate's blessing, I think Canberra will finally have something of substance on climate change. Our region can help build and improve on stronger requirements on reporting on progress against climate targets. Our leaders at their recent meeting have therefore welcomed and fully supported Australia's renewed commitment to our climate change priorities and welcomed the interest from Australia to host the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the parties in partnership with Pacific Island countries. So much for climate change. But since March 2020, COVID-19 has of course overtaken events and changed the global and indeed regional security narratives in unprecedented ways. And we do have our own view of regional security and would therefore like to promote this. And this is again captured in the Boy Declaration, to which Australia is also a signatory, and it pointedly emphasizes a broad concept of security that includes human security, humanitarian assistance, environmental security, and regional cooperation in building resilience to disasters and climate change. We advocate a Blue Pacific strategy as the unifying narrative for the regional community. This defines a Pacific Islands region with its own priorities and purposes. For Solomon Islands, just like some other Pacific countries, we endorse a French dual, as my friend here has alluded to, approach, valuing our economic and security relations with China, just as we do with Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Japan, and other development partners. The last 50 years of diplomacy in our region, I think, has been about asserting our rights to determine what happens in our region. At the very least, we expect that relationship within the Pacific family be conducted on an equal and respectful basis. Any security pact aimed at pitching one against the other is a pact we will be very, very cautious to align with. But to get an appreciation of the particular challenges confronting Solomon Islands, let's perhaps start with people and look at our population and the rate of our population growth. I think for this is the most important determinant of what we are going to do to support our people. In 1931, our population was 94,000. In 1974, it was 161,000. And 4 years later, upon independence in 1978, it was 211,000. And the census of 2019 recorded a population of 721,000. And by 2031, it is estimated to exceed 1 million and overtake Fiji to become the second largest, excluding Australia and New Zealand, of course, in the Pacific. And by 2050, it is estimated to reach 1.35 million and to increase by 570,000 in the next 30 years. Now, if we are already struggling to feed, educate, and provide adequate jobs for our current population of 721,000 this year, how will we cope with the challenges of providing the same services for 135 million people in 2050 with the same level of natural resources we now have? This is the reality we face today, and a reality that must shape the national strategies and important priorities going forward. So what are these priorities? COVID-19 is, of course, one of them. In early 2020, it posed significant economic and social challenges when countries started closing their borders and affected our trade and travel. In January 2022, we had our first cases of community transmission. However, despite our low vaccination rate of only about 50%, and thanks to Australia and other development partners' support, we had a shorter period of community transmission and few numbers of very severe infections and deaths compared to other countries. We therefore opened our borders on 1st July. The unfinished business of the Constitution and state governments must also be addressed, as well as the Townsville implementation of the Townsville Peace Agreement and the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The riots in November last year were not coincidental. They reflected deep-seated dissatisfaction over public issues which simply cannot be ignored. The government is committed to implement this with the TRC report now tabled in Parliament, with an update on the implementation of its recommendations, and a bill to establish a commission to consider all the outstanding claims related to the ethnic conflict will also be tabled in Parliament. Work with the Electoral Commission to review parts of the Electoral Act based on the lessons related to the ethnic conflict has already started. This includes the proper registration of voters and out-of-constituency voting. The Commission will also review some sections of the Political Parties Integrity Act before the next general election. Major economic development projects on water, health, education, and women have also been earmarked for provinces. So COVID-19, I think, has clearly showed us that investing in our health and educational services is critical, and we must continue to invest in them. And women too, who mostly carry the burden of looking after families. But we cannot go it alone. Someone has to meet us halfway if we are to go the distance. And thanks to the government and people of Australia, we now have more than 3,000 workers here under the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. Our labour mobility strategy for 2019 to 23 has identified Australia as the market with the highest potential for the supply of workers. We are therefore targeting at least 5,000 workers to be recruited under the PALM scheme by the end of this year. Now, the beauty about this scheme is that the remittances workers go directly to their intended recipients with no one in between, apart from the medium of transmission to siphon off any of the hard-earned remittances. And it's a triple win situation for the employer, the worker, and of course, our respective countries. And since the PALM is confined only to regional and rural Australia, maybe it's time to open up the entire country, especially the metropolitan cities, where the demand for plumbers, welders, bricklayers, carpenters, domestic servants, waiters and waitresses, caregivers, etc., is huge. There has to be more flexible, reciprocal movement of skills and transfer of knowledge to help each other progress. Our aim is for full reciprocal labour mobility between the islands and between the islands and Australia and New Zealand. We already have our nurses in Vanuatu and seasonal workers in New Zealand under the RSE scheme. These workers, one of the biggest investments that is allowing Pacific Islanders to not only support their families financially, but also giving them a better understanding of Australian and New Zealand culture and values. They will be the biggest supporters of our enduring relationship. In 2021, we had 40 students here in Australia. 14 were funded by Australia and 26 by the Solomon Islands government. Many would be here if only they pay local tuition fees instead of the prohibitively expensive international fees. Solomon Islands ratified PESA Plus in June 2020. It has entered into force, and Australia's specific horticultural and agricultural market access farmer scheme is already supporting our exporters of tropical products meet its quarantine and health requirements. But much could be done here in Australia on promotion, market testing, and research to improve the access of our products to the Australian market. We have, as a Pacific family, give visas on arrival amongst ourselves for a long time, except from Australia and New Zealand. Why? It's a pity, I'm told, that 47 countries have working holiday visas and not one of them is from the Pacific Islands. That's not how to win friends. That's not how to win the minds and hearts of Pacific Islanders over another. So let's allow for reciprocal visa on arrival. Otherwise, we might be a Pacific family, but only for some things. That is not really a Pacific family, is it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I won't get back to questions, but I just want to get the first one in. You both outlined some deep-seated challenges there, economic infrastructure, democracy, and also how to obtain revenue. Could I just ask you to consider ecotourism? I think High Commissioner Carley mentioned that. Is that a particular area in the tourism field where cooperation and bringing down the barriers to tourism, making infrastructure and ways of visiting your respective countries easier for visitors that might return now that the pandemic hopefully is on its way, might return some revenue to your state budgets?
Well, the plus with ecotourism is firstly, you are making use of the environment around you. And whatever infrastructure that you build has got to be friendly with the environment. Secondly, the people who are going to be involved are mostly the people in the rural areas. And we are really encouraging families to get together and work out how they can utilize their resources. There's jungles, there's islands, there's reefs in which the people can build, and the revenue is going to the people in the rural areas, and in that way they're also improving their lifestyles, improving their ability to sustain their lives.
High Commissioner, I guess my question is really around if you're getting tourism to come to one of your countries in the region, how can they be encouraged to stay longer and visit others?
Okay. Well, firstly, we've got to improve the law and order situation too as well, and then encourage them lower the cost of transport between the countries to get them in and give them a good cultural introduction.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's also one area we were already into before the COVID-19. And ecotourism, especially for the rural areas. And that's the kind of development where local people can also afford with some government support. The issue of law and order, I think, is not a problem because law and order issues mainly in town in Honiara. But if you go out to the province, especially Western Province, I think there's a lot of potential there. But like I said, COVID-19 disrupted everything. But now I think it's picking up again.
All right, we've got about 20 minutes now for questions. So if you want to ask one from the floor, please indicate and stand up and say your name. John.
Excellencies, John Blackstone, Professor at the ANU. John Blackstone from the ANU. It's a real pleasure to hear your remarks this evening. Thank you very much. And really heartening to hear your ideas there, Commissioner Sisilo, about what can be done to improve relations to make the family work better. That's really great. I'm struck though that there are things in the news that are upsetting people in Australia. Certainly there's a little slightly sensational media coverage on some of the issues relating to China's footprint in the Solomon Islands, Australia's engagement to help with the crisis back in November, where Australian federal police and troops go and help, and then Prime Minister Sogavare turns to China for help, rather than it looks a little bit like a bit of a slap in the face to Australia. And so I'm wondering, and of course the news the last few days, the reports about the potential sale of some islands that are considered having strategic significance. I'm wondering, what can we do to change the dynamics there, to make it better? You've come up with some suggestions there. Is there, one of the things that strikes me is there's probably scope for some kind of quid pro quo. What can the Solomon Islands do for Australia, and what can we do for you? Thanks.
Well, yeah, thank you. Let's go back to the riot first. I was in Honiara during the riots. I was in fact in quarantine, just about Chinatown, and actually watching the. But I don't think we did approach China first. We did to Australia. That's why they sent the troops. Yeah. That was our first partner of the choice. So we requested Australia's assistance. China is something that came later, but our partner of choice is always Australia. And like you said about the ABC in the Four Corners program, talking about sale of land, I don't think that will actually eventuate. Okay. I think that's just something they got somewhere, but I don't think people will be just willing to sell a piece of land to the Chinese for military purposes. And I think our Prime Minister has already assured your Prime Minister that the big concern about having a military base in Solomon Islands is certainly not on. Yeah. And I don't think it ever will, because I think we all know that if we have a military base in the country, I mean, that's certainly a potential target for any country that has a conflict, say with China or something, because that will be the first, and people are aware of it. And I think we had also some nasty memories of World War II. So that lingers on people's mind. Yeah. But in terms of our cooperation, I already stated some of the areas that we think Australia can come in big time and establish some sort of relations, improve them.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Michael Percy, University of Canberra. Your Excellencies, thank you for the presentation. I'm really interested in how Australia's involvement in the region is perceived from your perspective, in particular its consistency over time. I get the feeling that it's sort of waned in the last few years and it's sort of come back out of necessity more recently, but I'm just really interested in your perceptions of Australia's engagement and that consistency over time and how that impacts upon our respective relationships. Thank you.
Well, I mean, from the Solomon Islands perspective, I think Australia has always been a major development partner. Only on climate change, I think that's where we sort of thought, I think they should come, at least in terms of the commitment. I think that's only an area that we were not really happy about. But now that with the new government, I think certainly things will, our relations will certainly improve. But otherwise, I mean, we always regard Australia as our closest neighbor and, of course, our biggest development partner. I don't think it has dropped a ball anytime in the past, but only on climate change, I think that's an issue that has sort of, put not only Solomon Islands, I guess the whole Pacific countries, but we're not really happy about that. But I think for now, well, let's see what happens.
I think Papua New Guinea and Australia are very robust and very strong relationship dating back years, and it's only gone stronger. But I do agree that there's been a parting of ways in recent times. But I'm happy to say that this new government is starting to, re-establish itself in terms of looking seriously at how we can, merge support coming in with our structures and our people, and get more of the local content in terms of instead of getting managing contractors, for example, from Australia to do the work in PNG, why don't you open it up, have a procurement process where Papua New Guinea firms, Papua New Guinea expertise is given the last, opportunity to apply and be given the first right of refusal. And in that way, you get in Papua New Guineans, working together with Australians to jointly design, jointly develop, and jointly deliver on projects in Papua New Guinea. But I think the Pacific Step Up was an attempt to re-establish that, and I'm happy that the new Labour government has, really come in a long way to go into our houses and sit down with us and have a meal.
Take one question from the back and then one from online. Martin.
Hello, excellent. This is Martin from the local branch. Many years ago, I was working with PNG. I can't speak for the Solomon Islands point of view, but to be honest, I found many of the programs I was involved with frustratingly irrelevant to many of the people in PNG. It was many years ago before the term woke was invented, but many of them were of that ilk. And they didn't get the engagement from the local people that I thought they deserved, given the amount of money that was spent. And I'm wondering if I'm out of date now, but and you might not feel comfortable answering this, but I wonder if some of the programs that we develop or provide through DFAT and also are appropriate and relevant and useful in terms of value for money.
Well, I think I touched on it when I was answering the previous question. It's important that any support or aid in whatever form, it's got to be based on the priorities of the country that you're trying to help. In the case of PNG, we have a long-term plan, a long-term vision, and we have medium-term development plans that support that. And we would think, and we also have established processes and structures, which I think are working well. But if the person who's coming to help us feels that they're not working well, help us fix them so that they can work. But not for you to come and say, that's where I think the problem is. And then pour the resources into the area where you think it should be fixed. I would rather think that the people know the answers, but they just need the technological support, modern knowledge to be able to address those issues on the ground. And any support must be embedded within our structures so that they can, or the people who are doing it are engaged, have ownership of the processes, and it can work and you can achieve results on the ground. But I agree that, and there was an independent review done in 2010, and as a consequence, the whole system was refocused and reset. So thank you.
Gentlemen, I'd like to come back to something that in particular Robert McCoy was making about remittances and the importance to the economies of your countries that plays. Clearly, there's some movement there in terms of Australia and New Zealand new programs. But Liz Morris online is asking, what protections do you think should be in place to protect from exploitation those workers who might be coming outside outside and back?
Well, yeah, thank you. Nobody said this is going to be a perfect system. In fact, over the weekend I was in Townsville, I think, yeah. So I went to AIIA and Bohen, yeah, to visit some of the workers. Yes, they do have some issues, but we're always trying to sort them out with the approved employer or the grower to try and sort things out. But yes, we have some issues on pay slips and overtime and minimum pay, accommodation. But we are trying to sort them out, and we just our messaging to our workers that if there's any issue, please, try and sort it out. You have a team leader there, discuss it with them, then he'll go and see the management or the employers. But don't upscore, don't run away fast. Try and sort it out. If it doesn't get sorted out at that level, then the team leader will give us a call, then we'll go down and try and also discuss it with DFAT. So yes, nobody said this is going to be a perfect system, but we're trying to make it a perfect system.
Well,
But the remittances, yes, that's big time. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Previously, the arrangements were government to government, but I think it's changed. Now it's going to be employer and employer to employee sort of relationship. When that happens, one of the key things that we've really demanded as a combined Pacific heads of missions is to set in the mechanisms that account for grievances to be addressed in a structured way, so that any employee who's aggrieved on the shop floor must have some place to report that grievance so that it can be addressed. If he's not satisfied or she is not satisfied, there must be another level that they can go to. And I'm happy that the Australian government has seen that. And you can see why there's a high levels of abscondment. It's purely because they don't know where to go. But with this institution of this grievance procedure, we hope, and welfare groups, we hope that we can go a long way in having this addressed on the shop floor, and therefore improve the productivity, but do away with a lot of the abscondment that's taking place.
Got time for one or two more questions. Yes.
Yes, independent thinker. Thank you for your presentations. The Australian Federal Police has had long-term programs in both nations, building capacity for your Indigenous police forces along the lines of liberal democratic policing approach. That appears to be being questioned at the moment, particularly in the Solomon Islands, with the advent of some of the agreements with the Chinese National Police. Is the preferred model in your countries, but also more broadly in the Pacific, more inclined to be liberal democratic and more autocratic?
What's the question again?
Is the approach in your respective countries likely to be more liberal autocratic or more liberal democratic?
Okay, yeah, well, I think it's more liberal democratic. We have advisors from Australia coming down to advise, train I think only last week got some of our officers here in Canberra. So the training they got here, and when the Australians come, I think they're doing it good, in terms of, building their capacity. And I don't think we don't really have any complaints with our, the Australians coming down and training our police officers. I think they're doing a marvelous job. But of course, the Chinese are also there. I recall, as I've said, I was there during the riot, and my understanding, what I was told, was that when the Australian troops came in, they didn't really go down to protect the Chinese, Chinatown, and even the Chinese embassy. That's the information I got from some of our officials. That's why our government has no option but to turn to China to make sure that they come and reinforce our have some arrangements where in the event that our major partner, can't fill in some gaps, then we have the option or the alternative where we can tend to fill those potential gaps. I think that's how, we ended up, getting some Chinese police officers to come and train our officers too. But I think it's also good to have, both police officers from different countries, coming and sharing their own experiences with our police officers.
Similar arrangement, but it's like I said earlier, as long as they come in working within our structures and they work to our police commissioner, and they must understand that the police commissioner is in charge, and they must operate within our laws. There was a time when we thought that the Australian police could come and patrol the streets with our Papua New Guinea police force, but our courts ruled it unconstitutional because
That's right.
we cannot have a sovereign police force running our country. So, but there's a lot of demand to reposition and rebuild the confidence of the people in the police force, and the Australian government is helping in a great way to support our police policemen develop with strong ethics and good values.
Right, last question from.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. My name is Lena Schumacher. I'm with the Danish Embassy here in Canberra. You mentioned yourself the climate change, and we of course agree that climate change is a great problem for the world and not least for the Pacific. My government is very progressive on cutting down on CO2 emissions, and I'm just wondering, in terms of your perspective, if you could share some of the thinking within your government on use of alternative energy, renewable sources of energy as a way of cutting CO2. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, we are certainly in the Solomons into that. We have a mini Tina hydro power where it's funded by the Green Climate Fund or something. Yeah, a couple of million. Australia has also pumped in something like $100 million, and that's still under construction. Still being built, and the intention is that it will supply power mainly to Honiara, and it will certainly have a big impact in terms of reducing, the amount of fossil fuel that we are using. Solomons happens to be, I think, the most expensive country when it comes to fuel. I was told this when I was in New York at the UN. I was sort of taken aback, but they said, no, this is it. And I think I agree, because when they went to Honiara the last time, it was pretty expensive. But now with this, Ukraine situation, it has even gone worse.
Yeah, I think that's the only way to go, is to look for alternative sources of energy. Papua New Guinea has got a lot of rivers. We want to convert those to hydropower, but also use what's caught up for water supply for our people, clean water, solar. Pacific has got more sun than any other place in the earth. So why don't we utilize the sun, and capture the sun to drive as an alternative energy. Wind, there's plenty of wind. Thermal energy, those are the options that our government is looking at. And we're getting great support from the Norwegian government and also the European Union in that space.
All right. Well, an hour is barely enough to talk about the affairs of the Pacific and ways of dealing with multiple challenges, but I'm afraid we need to draw a line under it there. So on behalf of the ACT branch of the AIIA, I'd like to thank both of our speakers tonight for imparting some sense of optimism, I think would be fair to say, and also to pass on a small token of appreciation and a memento from us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope you can come, join up and come to our meetings regularly in future.
Yes.
Our next meeting, we'll send you details. We hope for one in September. If not, we've got several very interesting presentations coming up in the month of October, November. So stay tuned, and good evening, everyone.